yours.
I'm mindful of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's already 10 o'clock. We'll start and people will be joining as they come in.
Okay.
Welcome to this second day of this week's of kindness celebrations. We are celebrating the World Kindness Week along with so many other global organizations. This event is not isolated, so we have combined our practice, our speeches, our programs with World Kindness Week celebrations. And this is the second year we are doing the annual celebration of Center for Excellence, Empathy, Equity, and Diversity. Yesterday, we had a successful program on mediation training skills with excellent speakers and excellent chairs of the sessions. And we had a good discussion on so many topics that range between social justice, compassion, and it came to how individual as a professional grow in terms of conflict, in terms of mediation, in terms of conflict resolution as a believer or a non-believer. And the last topic was forgiveness. So I said forgiveness will be the topic that continues today and tomorrow, because we need to be reminded that forgiveness does exist in everyone's mind, but we need to be conscious and need to be reminding each other that forgiveness is important to be in a peaceful and harmonious way of living in workplace and at home and wherever we are.
Been unfair or hurtful or otherwise harmed you in some way. Forgiveness is not merely accepting what happened or ceasing to be angry. Let me pause on that. One of the problems with forgiveness is that because it's a concept and a practice that's been used for over the millennia, it's accumulated a lot of meanings. And so you talk about using forgiveness as a way of resolving a substantial interpersonal injury. And people, they may say, oh, you just want me to let them off the hook. You want me to forget about it. So this is a psychological approach to forgiveness is very different than all of that. So it's not merely accepting what happened or ceasing to be angry. Rather, it involves a voluntary, so it's a deliberate transformation of feelings, attitudes, and behaviors so that you're no longer dominated by resentment and can express compassion, generosity, or the like towards the person who wronged you. So transgressions are violations of interpersonal boundaries. They can be ethics, morals, physical space, reasonable expectations. That the research shows, and this is a really key point, I'd like to identify it as a key point. The research shows that a transgression, particularly if it's a substantial transgression, let's imagine a marital infidelity, that or being robbed by somebody, or somebody's works being stolen by somebody at work, work product being stolen, it activates an automatic cascade of negative cognitions, affects, and behaviors. So the cognitions include some confusion, rumination, blameful attributions, and stereotyping. So the thought, our mind becomes populated by thought loops of, look at what they've done wrong to me, and they're a terrible person for doing that, and they're sick, and just the whole negative characterization, which too often can result in a stereotyping such as they're vermin, or they have personality disorders, or racial stereotyping, this is the way these people are, whatever. The negative emotions include anger, resentment, bitterness, hostility, and hatred. And the negative behavioral tendencies include avoidance of the perpetrator, holding a grudge, vengeance seeking, and demands for atonement or retribution. Now, it's certainly natural and healthy for people to be angry after they've been transgressed. And that anger can be used in a constructive way to clarify boundaries, to strengthen boundaries. People become better at protecting themselves, setting limits in relationships. But what people aren't good is at recognizing how their mind, particularly if it's a really substantial transgression, again, using marital infidelity as an example, their mind in some way has been fractured. that if we fracture a leg, we all kind of know what that means, that the person's not going to be able to walk in a strong way. They're going to experience a certain kind of pain. They're going to maybe have some depression and anxiety. It's going to last a long time. But when we get hurt, we don't say to each other that, boy, you're going to be trapped in all of these negative cognitions, these thought loops in which you're blaming the other person, you're ruminating about what's happened and so forth. Rather, we're too quick to think I should get over it or they should get over it. And this seems to be a missing piece. And as a clinician, getting people to identify how they're caught in these thought loops or emotional loops is very difficult. They're very quick to go out and start reciting the grievances that they were subjected to, rather than saying, okay, that happened, but I'm trying to find peace. I'm trying to restore autonomy. I'm trying to get back to being the person I want to be, which is a kind and loving person. Even possibly at one extreme, I want to have no relationship, but I don't want to feel hatred towards this person. I want to wish them well. But they tend to, the impact on the mind tends to preoccupy them and make it difficult for them to reflect and see how they're caught in these dynamics. So one of the key distinctions that's made in the forgiveness literature is between decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness. So what this amounts to is that there's a cognitive component to forgiveness and there's an emotional component. So it may be, for example, that if I'm working with a dad who feels that mom has estranged the affection of the children from him, I may say, the first step for you is to make a commitment to not being angry, to interrupting your angry thoughts, interrupting thoughts that have to do with seeking revenge or punishment, not ruminating about the offense and placing blame, and giving up a sense of entitlement to hold resentment. That's not so hard to do because we're in control of we can interrupt our thinking, we can distract ourselves. The other component is more difficult. It's emotional forgiveness. It's giving out undeserved compassion and generosity, finding that your emotions have become less negative and more positive towards the person who hurt or offended you. Generally, decisional forgiveness is achieved before emotional forgiveness. Emotional forgiveness is much more difficult to achieve. That I thought I would highlight that forgiveness involves recognizing and responding to the humanity of the person responsible for the hurtful interpersonal injustice. This is the key, perhaps the key gate to moving from anger into some kind of forgiveness and some type of benevolent motivation towards the offender. Forgiveness involves acknowledging the wrongdoing impact without minimizing, seeing the injustice as evidence that the wrongdoer needs positive change. So it may be that the best you can do or best a person can do is that I hope they have some kind of corrective experience so they no longer engage in that kind of behavior. And generally desiring the good of the person responsible for the wrongdoing, even when the relationship cannot be restored. So yesterday, Dr. Worthington presented his REACH model, and it's one of the two principal models in the literature on forgiveness. And so just to briefly go over that, it is to recall the hurt differently than as a source of rage or woundedness. It's emotional reprocessing, so replacing the unforgiving emotions, resentment, bitterness, hostility, hatred, anger, and fear with empathy, sympathy, or compassion, giving an altruistic gift of forgiveness. The hurt that was imposed, the blow that was absorbed was unfair by definition. That's my definition through a forgiveness process. And that the person cannot be made whole, particularly when it comes to a relationship problem. That if it's a property problem, you can pay money. But if it's a relationship problem, you can't unring the bell, as it said. And so in some sense, it's like, I'm going to forgive you, even though I'm going to carry the legacy of this hurt indefinitely. It's a commitment to the emotional experience emotional forgiveness that's experienced. Forgiveness tends to wax and wane. It's a hard process. We remember that something reminds us of the hurt, so we kind of get sink back into the anger and the bitterness and hold on to the forgiveness when doubts occur. Now, forgiveness may be related to reconciliation or not. That reconciliation is the process of rebuilding positive relationships towards a shared future. That if a person is a victim of a sex offender, then it wouldn't, no, we don't want them to reconcile with the sex offender. We may want them to forgive the sex offender so they're no longer carrying around anger and resentment. It is possible to forgive but not reconcile, and to reconcile without forgiveness. It does seem, though, that true reconciliation requires forgiveness. As Robert Enright points out, reconciliation without forgiveness is often no more than an armed truce in which each side patrols the demilitarized zone looking for incursions by the other and waiting to resume hostilities. So the research shows that there are factors that promote forgiveness, and those include education about what forgiveness is and what it's not, taking an inventory of transgressions and injuries. This is key. So if a person's been injured, it's important to say to them, I want to hear about everything that happened here, all of the transgressions that occurred, and all of the impacts that that had on you. Your emotions, your behavior, perhaps it changed your attitude towards the world, it changed your attitude towards relationships. I want to understand how deep and how broad the impact was on you of this unjust transgression. So enabling the person to do that can promote forgiveness. You know, the next element is an apology. Well, an apology, I mean, even between groups, between nations, apologies occur. Actually, we're seeing, I think, more apologies being offered. You know, the British apologized to the Irish for Bloody Sunday. The Germans apologized to the Jews for the Holocaust. And apologies, if they're skillfully done, can communicate to the victim, I understand the nature of my transgression, the extent of the damage that you absorbed, and I understand how I'm personally responsible for that, not only for the impact that it had on you, but for being the person or the type of country or the type of political system that would put itself in the position that that kind of a transgression could occur. So it's experiencing not only an apology for the hurt the other person suffered, but also a genuine sense of remorse for what one did or what one group did, and what it was underneath of that that allowed for that kind of a transgression to occur. Then Dr. Worthington has done a fine job of identifying ways of promoting decisional forgiveness and promoting emotional forgiveness, that promoting decisional forgiveness can include identifying specific offended behaviors as targets for forgiveness. So if a person says, you know, they're a terrible person and I'll never forgive them, well, it's necessary to break that down into what specifically did they do. Give me a list of 10 things or 15 things or whatever it is, and let's look at those one at a time. Maybe some of those are forgivable, maybe some aren't. Making a formal commitment to the decision process helps decisional forgiveness. So this can be tricky because people can push back against the idea of forgiveness and so forth. So it requires some skillful dialogue and diplomacy to get people there sometimes. Identifying hostile behaviors that indicate unforgiveness. So sometimes people they don't see how they're continuing to entertain the hostility that they feel towards the other person. You know, for me, it's oftentimes that people will default into a recitation of the grievances. You know, they'll go through for the 5th or 6th or 7th time. He did this, or she did this, or she did that, or she did that. It's like, no, please notice how you're in a thought loop and interrupt yourself there. And so it may need that the person needs some therapy to do cognitive restructuring. That is to get them to look at all these negative thought patterns that are automatic, that are just, you know, running on self-renewal, and to get better at interrupting those. That promoting emotional forgiveness, there are illustrations of forgiveness in the popular media. For example, Oprah Winfrey says forgiveness is giving up the hope that the past could have been any different. It's accepting the past for what it was and using this moment and this time to help yourself move forward. Certainly, there are quotes by Nelson Mandela or Bishop Tutu. The movie A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, starring Tom Hanks, is a fine example of forgiveness in action. That it's emotional replacement through contact with the offender. Oftentimes it's developing emotional regulation skills. There's many people who are so for what occurred. And then, you know, things like recalling the offense, that can be helpful. And imaginations of a positive and peaceful relationship future. Oftentimes people are like, I can't imagine being anything better. I can't imagine this person being better. I see that I've run out of time, so I'll complete this. There's a lot of hopelessness themes and despair themes that get generated in the cognitive loops. And so it's to get people to interrupt that and say, you know, we all learn, there's lots of stories about people, redemption stories, if you will, like a Scrooge, and A Christmas Carol is one of the most popular ones, a terrible person who had a redemption experience and had a magical transformation. So thank you very much. And at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Vitali.
Thank you, Dr. John. I now welcome Dr. Vanda Vitali to present her ideas on forgiveness.
Thank you. Well, I am a museum practitioner, as Dr. Taher has said. And so what I would like to do today is talk a bit about the reconciliation in museum practice and where we can and should perhaps focus on forgiveness or rather introduce forgiveness as a concept in order to arrive at a more successful outcomes of reconciliation. So very quickly, I will, museums are often in the news about various acts and attempts to reconcile their past with their present. And, but we ought to know that museums have had several decades of experience with repatriation. Something that I will touch upon. There are, of course, reconciliation projects in conflict site museums, be that in Rwanda or in Normandy, in the World War II museums, in Jewish museums across the Western world, and in memorial sites such as Khmer Rouge, for instance, atrocities that happened, and then memorial sites for those. So these are really wide international initiatives. So repatriation is considered a practice that is extremely important for reconciliation of museums and communities. And in Canada, it is mostly a practice between individual museums and individual communities. From my own practice, Royal Ontario Museum has done remarkable work in returning objects, and so has done British Royal Canadian Museum in British Canada Museum in Vancouver, in Victoria. So North America deals a lot with repatriation between communities and between museums. International repatriation is also well-established practice. New Zealand has over 20 years now been accepting human remains and asking for human remains to be returned to New Zealand. And I have viewed almost monthly return of these remains to their communities or to the general community, which has helped a lot in bridging the understandings between communities. But we also see now international movements. France is, for instance, dealing with West Africa, with Burkina Faso, with Senegal, with Cameroon, in returning artifacts. We've seen the ecofacts, that is biological remains or geological remains. For instance, dinosaur remains being returned to Argentina from where they were taken. And of course, everybody has heard about the return of works of art that have been looted by Nazis during the German occupation period and returned to their Jewish owners. The museum practice has many manuals and guidelines. We have responded to calls for international commissions, international and national commissions. Museums have done a lot in that sense. And there is retributions are a part of that. But the fact is that these processes are extremely complex. They're complex because of the various differences in handling objects and artifacts, in understanding what is appropriate way of dealing with them, what is appropriate way of dealing with communities, but also what are the international laws. And then there are objects that are having spent number of years in air-conditioned conditions in the Western museums suddenly have to be returned to non-air-conditioned conditions from which they came. And so we know that that is the most detrimental to objects. So how should they be treated? When should they be treated? How should that return of objects be carried out? It's quite a big debate and a process that have been initiated and they're going on, and mostly very successful. Museums evolve, of course, as society evolves, and more recently, museums are adopting equitable and inclusive practices in their engagement with ideas and identity and diversity issues. So museums are establishing departments of indigenous curators, for instance, or curators of different ethnic groups in order to be able to deal with the arts and interpretation of heritage that is appropriate. Small museums are just establishing perhaps curatorial positions. Most museums are dealing with collection management practices that are now updated to include the knowledge and indigenous approaches in them. Exhibitions and programs that educate and foster understanding are there. Community consultations is a very broad and well-established practice in dealing with communities before museums go ahead with their programs and exhibitions. And most recently, governance bodies that include diverse presentations have been established, and museums are very much working on that. So current situation is something like this. There is a great deal of complexity and the slowness of these processes. If you think that it takes 3 years to organize an exhibition, to organize an exhibition that includes different perspectives is, of course, complex, and we have to learn from each other. And so there is a slowness that is something that nobody wants. You know, everybody would like to have this done much more quickly, much more efficiently, much more effectively. But the fact is that this is a slow process. And then for me, one of the key issues is that we really don't understand well and don't have an agreement about what does it mean to have a reconciled museum? What does a reconciled museum looks like? What does a reconciled society looks like? So while there are a lot of experiences with these, this is still work in progress, and there is a lack of data on the progress that is being made with all these different policies and procedures that museums are following and establish. And so if I look at going forward, I think that we need to include and focus a bit more, not a bit more, but to include forgiveness and start considering about forgiveness. Because as we have heard from John Moran, and yesterday from different speakers, including Professor Worthington, that the real reconciliation without forgiveness is not an effective reconciliation. So museums deal a lot with emotional processes, emotional exhibitions, emotional programs. And so as they do that, they really would need, in my opinion, to include consideration of forgiveness. The promoting dialogue with affected parties, striving for consensus of the harm done on responsibility and corrective practices, including forgiveness, is something that museums need to consider. And in order to do that, they would need to engage moderators with working knowledge of psychology and forgiveness. We heard yesterday from Dr. Worthington about the REACH program. For instance, that is something that museums should try to implement. And then, of course, they should develop evidence-based assessment of these programs. That, in order to give the community and the practitioners a sense of what is working, how best to achieve results, and how to engage communities in this process. And finally, I think that development of supraordinate group identity is something that museums should try to work on and include in their programming. Now, many would argue that supraordinate identity may dilute individual identities, but that's not what I'm thinking about. Humanity is a great supra-identity, and forgiveness and humanity go hand in hand. And that is something that museums should involve and include in their practice. So in concluding this, I think that forgiveness, in my opinion, would augment museum reconciliation practices. But it cannot be done alone. It has to be done with other intellectual and political considerations. And museums can be a part of a broader political spectrum of activities and initiatives leading or dealing with forgiveness and reconciliation. And as French President Macron have recently said, that programs that include projects which inspire and bring together people around shared values and cultural interest is the best road to forgiveness and hence reconciliation. So museums as a part of a broader social and political system, I believe, can be very successful actors in promoting forgiveness and hence reconciliation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vanda. I forgot to mention that you'll have the questions and answers at the end of the program, because we will be having more time to discuss and ask questions. And so I have been skipping the question issue now. And we have Dr. Bruce Ali, who is the next speaker. Welcome, Dr. Bruce.
Thank you ever so much. So I'm going to try and share my screen here as well. So I'm hoping that that's available for folks, or no? Can you tell me if you're able to see that? Okay, so we're talking about mediation skills for forgiveness, and you've had two excellent presentations so far. You've had one that talks about, the second one that of course talks about forgiveness on a societal level, because as a culture and as a society, we cannot survive except we move in unison together. And we've had one that talked about the first with Dr. Moran, that talked about the individual perspective one brings to forgiveness. So in all fairness and truth, these guys are experts. For what it's worth, just a simple mediator who's been making my living as a mediator for the last 30 years on a full-time basis. I mediate for the Superior Court of Justice in Ontario, and I've done in excess of 4,000 mediations. In and above and beyond that, I've also taught mediation at Osgoode Hall Law School and York University and a couple of community colleges as well. I also function as the Canadian editor for Mediate.com and have published fairly frequently on aspects of mediation. So I wanted to begin with a couple of slides on mediation here. One by Mahatma Gandhi that talks about that we can never forgive, and forgiveness as the liberation, and Nelson Mandela. Forgiveness liberates the soul and it removes fear. So in reflecting on these two slides, and of course there are many, many slides we could think about, and many, many aspects and people who are significant that we can consider with respect to their contribution for forgiveness, Mother Teresa and many others, amongst others. We will note that by and large, there is a component of the individual choice process that has to be dealt with in this. Now, that component is sometimes overshadowed by the societal pressures we often feel. Of course, each of us speaks from the lenses we come from, and I speak from a context of working within a milieu in which mediation forms a part of a legal continuum. And it gets to the point where it almost becomes a rubber stamp. So if we can get to resolution, meaning a successful outcome, we don't necessarily need to continue consider the impact of the forgiveness piece around it. Oh, we've settled this matter, let's move on. What's missing in that equation, unfortunately, is the fact that even though the matter may well be settled, we still have a component that needs to be looked at. For years and years after, despite the fact that the matter may be settled, that person can still carry a residue with them. And it can still taint their life decisions over time. So, in as much as it's possible to have the resolution by itself without And it is also possible to have the emotional piece by itself without the functionality of integration and integrating the two. I would suggest that forgiveness does not really factor into creating a lasting solution. And the whole point in problem solving, whether it's through mediation or it's just sitting with your colleague and working out an issue, is to create a workable, lasting solution. So for me, forgiveness is a profound act that can lead to healing and reconciliation. And mediation skills play a crucial role in facilitating forgiveness, or should play a crucial role in facilitating forgiveness. Like I say, because of the systemic approach to mediation today, what tends to happen is we tend to negate that need for facilitating the forgiveness piece and focus mostly on the piece that deals with let's get to a settlement, which is just a piece of paper devoid of the emotion, devoid of the content that goes with it. And I would strongly suggest that in doing that, we're missing the most important and crucial elements that can be achieved in a mediation process. So let's talk about it from a perspective of understanding forgiveness, at least from the perspective I'm coming from. So it's a process of letting go of resentment, anger, and desire for revenge. And we know, and Dr. Moran has worked in the area of family law for a while, and the way the system is set up, at best, is adversarial. So there's a winner and a loser. But in the context of a winner and a loser, if you lose, you are looking to see how you can get back on the other side. And if you're a winner, well, you can lord it over the other person because the system is so polarizing. So we need to begin to look at how we can actually change the structure within the operating system so that it removes the win-lose situation. One of the things I do fairly frequently in mediation, and especially when I'm working with folks, is I pull out the Canadian coin, and you, of course, have American coins. Half of my family is American. My mom was American. My younger brother and several of them are. But it doesn't matter what coin. And what I do is I show them a toonie, which is a $2 coin in Canada. And I point out to them, if we were to look at this, it's got a queen's head. And of course, if we listen to your story, we'd be silly to say that that was not a queen's head, because it is a queen's head. But when we hear the other side, we would see that there's a polar bear. And again, we'd be silly to say that's not a polar bear. So I try to use that as a metaphor to move them from the right, wrong to this side, the resolution part. I try to get them to remove out of the equation, I am right and you are wrong, which is so pervasive in our culture, and unfortunately tends to reinforce the entire process and remove the ability to forgive. Because as we know, forgiveness is very complex and it's a tough emotional journey, right? And I believe that by using the right tools and by helping people to navigate the process, mediation can foster a better understanding amongst people. With that said, we need to talk about the role of various people. All too often, in many, many programs that teach mediation, teach peacekeeping, under whatever banner they use, they focus specifically only on theory. And by and large, while that's very foundational, it's important to have a foundational structure before you build a house, of course. It is not the be all and end all, because a house with just the foundation is incomplete until you put the doors and windows on it. And the reality of that is one of the things that we tend to do within the context of teaching mediation and within the context of practicing mediation and within the context of trying to create resolution is we insist on neutrality. Neutrality is a very, very good concept. But when we think from the perspective of a global village, which is what we're operating in today, because you've got people from every walk of life, every culture involved in processes. Deutsch in the Handbook of Conflict Resolution talks about the world being a global village and the ability to interact with people beyond borders as ever increasing. So when we talk about it from that perspective, to presume that it's only going to be done by a neutral may not be culturally appropriate, especially given that in some cultures, there has to be involvement and the need for neutrality is not present. So one of the first steps we need to do if we're going to get to resolution and we're going to get beyond resolution to forgiveness is we need to start developing a model that suits the people that come before us, as opposed to staying with a dogmatic process that says this is the way it is. Second part is to create a safe space. And safe space means different things for different people. And safe space also means to have a cultural and cross-cultural understanding of what constitutes safety for everyone. So consequently, when we're looking at a woman who is in hijab, who has got her head down and is not looking at us, we don't make assumptions like, well, there's a lack of truth because that person is not looking at us in the eye. So we have to inform ourselves of the nuances that are likely to play out within the context of any role play, any mediation, any process that will work towards resolution and potentially to obtain the opportunity to create forgiveness between the parties. Because while in many cases, obedience to authority may well suggest that the person says, yes, yes, I'll agree to this, it doesn't mean that they have felt good about what's gone on. It doesn't mean that after you have left, they will be able to function with that person. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting for 1 second that every mediation, every resolution process can end up in a transformative experience. Of course they can. One of the things we talked about was the perpetuators, and certainly we may not be using those approaches with a perpetuator. But within the context of the run-of-the-mill mediations, within the context of the run-of-the-mill resolution, you must be skilled in communication, empathy, and conflict resolution, as well as have a cultural appreciation for the nuances that people bring to the foray. You also need to be able to listen actively. And this happens every day in life, not just on a mediative level, but people come up to you, hi, how are you? And they don't want to hear beyond that. It's just a cursory process. And people are so reinforced in those processes that even within the context of sitting down to resolve things, they are unable to step out of that paradigm into a paradigm that actually actively appreciates listening. So it's up to you to create a circumstance that will facilitate that. A circumstance that will allow you to fully focus on what the person is saying without rushing, as we tend to do, on, okay, this and that. So here's the response. And let me get to the next response. But to sit with, understand, appreciate, and utilize what the needs are that are being expressed to get to resolution. That is the only way we can make the parties feel heard, understood, which is the first and one of the most crucial steps to forgiveness. Unless we do that, people will not feel that they've been heard and or that they can let go of what they need. As a mediator, one of the things I try to instill on the interns, on the people for the QMed who I supervise and the CMed designations, that they need to empathize with the experiences involved, not just from a perspective of there, I understand, but to truly walk a mile in that person's shoes. Alfred Adler, who was one of my favorite psychologists, talks about being able to walk a mile in a person's shoes in order to appreciate where they are coming from. And unless you're able to do that, your words just become rote and rhetoric. So we need to move beyond that if we're going to get to this forgiveness piece, which is foundational in creating unity. And we need to encourage the parties to see the situation from the other side's perspective, as Adler said, walk a mile in the other person's shoes. And only then can this understanding open, only by removing the right, wrong, can we begin to foster empathy and open the doors for forgiveness. So for that to occur, you have to be very effective in your communication. You should be able to encourage open and honest and respectful dialogue. And remember, respect means different things to different people. In some cultures, it's fairly frequent and common that you gesticulate or you get very excited in a voice. And in other cultures, it may well be that is, whoa, that is very offensive. So we have to be able to develop a circumstance that permits everyone to do what is best for them so that they can appreciate the safety of the setting you've created to work towards resolution and to work to begin the process of forgiveness. And more important than that, we have to be able to help the parties to express themselves honestly, which is something that doesn't happen fairly frequently. Honesty is a very hard word to find. Oftentimes in the process of disclosure or in talking with the other person, emotions run quite high. And of course, when we think on an emotional level, we no longer are thinking with the logical brain. It's the limbic system in the brain that tends to kick in the reptilian system, and we no longer are in control. So we need to create situations that can de-escalate that, because that runs counter to the forgiveness process, because you're being driven by animal thought as opposed to logical thought. I mean, remember this, you cannot logicalize emotion, right? So you must help the parties to regulate their emotion, avoid hurts, and avoid triggering past hurts, because who amongst us doesn't have hurts? Who amongst us hasn't had things happen to us that are bad? And how do we know what's going to trigger that? So we need to work very, very cautiously, carefully, and create a safer space, ensuring that the atmosphere is calm so that that can occur. We have to use a problem-solving approach so that we can identify the root causes of conflict. We have to encourage collaborative problem-solving to find mutually acceptable solutions. And this, of course, is a pivotal step to the forgiveness journey. With that said, we need to work towards closure and reconciliation. Forgiveness often leads to closure and reconciliation if done properly. If not done properly, it leads to resolution without that. So we need to understand, what do we want at the end of the day? On one level, on the one hand, one can consider, of course, okay, well, I get these people patched up and they go, if I don't fix it properly, we live in a moneyed society, they'll come back. On the other hand, if I help these people work properly and fix it, they'll be able to deal with their issues because I am not able to deal with and minister to all the needs that are around. In most court settings, and let me talk about the court setting in Ontario, there's about a 3-year backlog. And that's after you've been to pretrial, which is 18 months to get to pretrial. And that's after 2 years to actually file the claim. So you're talking about 7 years. This is a long time for people to carry stuff. It becomes more and more enmeshed in them. It takes on a life of its own. So it's very significant and important that you are able to get them to release all of this so they can move on. And you have to work with the parties towards a resolution that allows a fresh start so that closure can occur, because closure is a significant outcome of the forgiveness process. And there are, of course, many challenges and pitfalls. And one of them is the fact that gone are the days when ADR, alternative dispute resolution, was the same. Oh, we could try that. It has become today the prevalent mechanism for resolution. It surpasses even the court. So it's now become dispute resolution as opposed to that. The problem with that is it's now become co-opted within the court system. And having been co-opted within the court system, whether it's on the family level, it's on the civil level, it is now become a rubber stamp process on some levels. And we need to guard against this, because that, of course, does not help it. The other part of it is now become a part of the working vocabulary of people like myself who make a living doing this. So, of course, at the end of the day, you have the reality of paying the bills. And that is a driving force towards, okay, let's get this resolved and move on without spending the kind of time we need to. And again, I'm going to suggest that we need to guard against that. In conclusion, I'm going to suggest that most mediation programs that are around that teach are insufficient because they don't get to the forgiveness part. They just deal with it on a systemic process. They come only specifically from theory. And they also deal with the fact that we get to a resolution and that's good enough. It doesn't matter about the people after, does not follow through. So in contrast to that, given that I believe mediators can play a crucial role in the transformative journey that parties who come before them have, they need to enable resolution of conflicts, fostering healing and reconciliation. With that said, I'd like to thank you ever so much for listening to me. And I've left a slide up there in the event that you've got some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce. Very interesting approach for each speaker that we have. For example, Dr. John Moran brought the theory part of what is important in forgiveness and what is how to understand. Is it to forget or forgive? Which is important, theory-wise and practice-wise? And then Dr. Vanda brought up reconciliation as a part of the process to see forgiveness and its place in society. And Dr. Bruce now brought up the issue of empathy, human approach, and human touch in mediation and counseling towards forgiveness. Thank you for this excellent brainstorming and reminding session. Now we have audience. If they have questions, we are open for it. Imam Habib Ali, would you like to break the ice and just ask some question about forgiveness? Imam Habib Ali is our chaplain in the jail and corrections in Toronto, in Ontario. Are you there, Imam Habib? I have a question. I have posted the title of the book that I have in my library. It is the measures. Can you see the screen? Measures of religiosity. Maybe I need to share this. Measures of Religiosity is the book that I'm referring to. Let me pull up on the screen. This is a book about 10 or 20 years old, and Measures of Religiosity by Peter Hill and Ralph Wood. I understand they are trying to bring up a new edition. In this book, Measures of Religiosity is one interesting section on forgiveness, measuring forgiveness with a scale that is recommended by these experts. I have the page here. So this is a scale of forgiveness that they have included in the book called Measures of Religiosity. Has anyone any thoughts on these kind of scales that measure forgiveness?
Well, I can weigh, whoops, I can weigh in on that. No, I don't think so. The Enright Forgiveness Inventory continues to be one of the most used scales in forgiveness research literature. There's been a veritable explosion of research on forgiveness in the last 25 years. I think that prior to about 1995, forgiveness was considered to be in the domain of religion, philosophy, and psychology. And then Robert Enright, he developed the Enright forgiveness, first to pioneer a psychological approach to forgiveness. And then Dr. Worthington yesterday is probably, you know, we could say he's the second really outstanding research. He mentioned his student Mike McCullough, and Mike McCullough developed a trim. And the trim is probably the trim together with the Enright forgiveness are the two most used instruments for assessing forgiveness. And so in all the research we now, there's more than 120 studies that have looked at the impact of forgiveness on physiological measures, more than 70 studies that look at the efficacy of forgiveness interventions. And most of those studies use either the trim or the Enright forgiveness inventory or both. I'm happy I can provide copies of those instruments. Certainly references, citations are getting access to them. Anyone who wants, I think my email included in slide.
Thank you, Dr. John. Dr. Bruce, Dr. Vanda, any thoughts on the scales to measure forgiveness?
Yes, please. Imam Habib Ali, salam alaikum. First of all, the whole presumption of measures of forgiveness assumes that people are all unified and that we do not have our own individual capacities. By and large, psychological tests are great, and unfortunately, part of my dissertation was why psychological tests don't work. So much to my chagrin, the assumption that a test created can measure every single member of the population with some degree of accuracy in itself is problematic for me. More important than that, when you bring in culture into the context of this, and we look at how people react differently, and let me give you an example of this. Way back when in cross-cultural psych, they took some pictures of a soccer ball and they showed it to people in the West, and the kids all said, this is a soccer ball. And they showed it. Berry and Dassa did this study back as far back as the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, late 80s. And they showed it to people in Africa, and they looked at, because it was a picture of the ball looking down, it looked like a turtle to them. So for me, it's not about right or wrong. It's at the end of the day, people like Michel Labarne has written about the paradigm mediation process, and in terms of how to judge whether or not resolution has occurred based on a paradigm that operates within that person's life. And that for me is more succinct, because at the end of the day, if one person is 52%, if we can assume that that's how a percentage works, and the other is 65%, does that mean the person at 65% is more resolved than the person at 52%? I'm not sure that those things make sense within the context of human beings. We're very complex, and really and truly, you, at the end of the day, if I can sit with you and you can say, I feel truly fulfilled, this is gone, I'm done, I don't need a percentage of that. So I think it needs to be done on an individual perspective. So much to my chagrin, unfortunately, I don't necessarily ascribe to the text. Not to say it's wrong, but for me personally.
Well, I'll follow up with that a little bit. I mean, yesterday, Dr. Worthy talked about how research can predict group behavior, but it can't predict or control individual behavior. I think that's what you're talking about. The problem is sometimes referred to as grouped individual problem. So while there's certainly a place for research about forgiveness, and that necessarily is going to involve groups of people and using measures across groups of people, you're absolutely correct. It doesn't apply to the individual. Ultimately, that's what you're working with. Even within groups, forgiveness occurs a person at a time. I will say, however, though, that there is a fair amount of research out there on cross-cultural differences in forgiveness. There's some elements of forgiveness that are universal across cultures, but more prominent is the differences between cultures. For example, oftentimes the differences studied between individualistic and collective cultures. So the United States, or Western countries, democracies, forgiveness is thought as an individualistic thing. It's a way for a person to liberate themselves from unwanted feelings, unwanted thinking. Whereas in collectivist cultures, or Eastern cultures, forgiveness is approached more as a way of restoring and maintaining social harmony. So all of these factors have to be taken into consideration. I have another thought too, because you asked earlier about to prison population. There's an interesting book called The Forgiveness Project. Journalist Maria from England has assembled a really lovely book about stories of people who have suffered in really insufferable harms and then practice forgiveness as a way of responding to it. And she, out of that project, has worked in the prisons and working with the prisoners on shame. And I don't know much about that, but it's clear to me that she has taken in the direction of that. For the incarcerated people, they carry a burden of shame for whatever it is that led. So that's, I think, another component of forgiveness we haven't talked about. Maybe.
The other question I have is, which one is more important or more significant in forgiveness in terms of moral injury or physical injury? Would you be able to highlight this?
I don't know. There's different. Well, the research is on how people appraise the significance of the injury, and certainly the extent of the damage is part of it. But how hurt a person feels also depends on things like, is there intention? So that if you're hurt in an accident and it's purely an accident, versus if you're hurt in an accident by a drunk driver, it's going to be a lot harder to forgive them and the feeling of just injury. But I think for the most part, we struggle with being hurt in relationships, not by being hurt physically. So it may be a fair statement that business of forgiveness maybe that's to the extent that it's a product of the unkind word or the betrayal or the falsehood, it's going to be more about violations of that. It's going to be about physical violence.
Thanks. Any other thoughts?
Yes, please. So I deal an awful lot with personal injury. People driving, they have a car accident. There are standards, medical standards that say, by and large, people will get better within this time frame. There's a percentage that don't. But the reality is that's physical injury. one of the things Dr. Moran just talked about was the emotional piece. And the question is, traumatic incident reduction talks an awful lot about you're going down a ski hill, you fall, you break your leg. When you see the picture replayed, it kind of takes you back. It triggers you back to that. But over time, with sufficient exposure and with the right amount of work, it can then be dealt with. So even though physically you've healed, emotionally you're not necessarily healed.
Yes.
And there needs to be specific work around the healing for that to occur. That's my thought.
Thanks. Dr. Vanda, any thoughts?
No, not really. You know, I deal with groups and particularly with different ethnic groups, and everything that was said today about the understanding of culture, about the importance of compassion, about creating safe space, about the complexity of our communication. All that is extremely important, which creates this, you know, ecology of forgiveness that is very complex and very important. But without it, I don't think we can arrive at reconciliation. And I think, as you said, a lasting, workable solution.
And you're absolutely right. I agree with that. The other part around that whole